The courtroom smelled of old wood, polish and rain that had followed everyone in from the parking lot. Fluorescent lights sat flat and colorless across the rows of the gallery, and the ceiling fans turned slow enough that nobody noticed, unless they stopped watching the woman at the defense table. She sat with her spine straight, wrists crossed loosely in her lap, the chain between the cuffs resting against the orange fabric of her jumpsuit, like something she had simply decided not to fight. Her name, according to the docket tape to the door, was Maya Reese. Her name, according to a file locked 3 states away in a federal building nobody in this county had ever heard of, was something else entirely. Detective Frank Wallace stood at the witness box, like a man who had never once doubted the sound of his own voice. 16 years on the force did that to people. It settled into the shoulders, into the way a man planted his feet when he talked, into the certainty that a badge and a uniform were on their own, a kind of proof. He had testified in this courthouse more times than he could count, and every time the jury had believed him. Because believing him was easier than the alternative, he raised his hand for the oath, the way other men raised a glass. Casual, practiced, already moving past it before the bailiff finished the sentence. "Detective, please describe what you found," the assistant district attorney said, flipping through a folder he barely needed. "I found the firearm myself," Wallace said, his voice climbing, the way it always did when he wanted a room to feel the weight of him. "Under the mattress, loaded. This isn't a woman who made one mistake, Your Honor. This is someone who has been running product through this county for years, hiding behind a smile in an apartment that looks like nothing's wrong." "Detective, lower your voice," the judge said, not looking up from his notes. Wallace didn't lower it. He turned toward the jury instead, the way a man turns toward an audience he has already won. People like her think the badge doesn't apply to them. They think if they stay quiet long enough, if they just sit there looking calm, somebody's going to believe the performance instead of the evidence. He gestured toward Maya without quite looking at her. "The way you gesture at furniture. I've seen it 100 times. This is just a very good one." At the defense table, Maya did not move. She had learned a long time ago that stillness said more than any objection her attorney could raise. And her attorney, a quiet woman named Denise Cole, who had taken this case for almost nothing 8 months earlier, understood that too, because she had not stood up once. Maya leaned toward her slightly and said something low enough that only the front 2 rows caught it. "He's under oath." Wallace heard it anyway. He smiled, a smile of a man who had never once been made to answer for anything. "Is that supposed to scare me, sweetheart?" "It isn't fear." Detective Maya's voice did not rise. "It did not need to. It's arithmetic. Every lie you tell from that chair today is a year added to a sentence. Somebody's anyway. Keep counting." A ripple moved through the gallery, kind of low murmur that courtrooms produce when something has shifted. But nobody can yet say what. An older woman in the second row wearing a church coat, despite the summer heat, gripped a thin gold watch on her wrist and did not look away from the woman in the jumpsuit. A young officer near the back exit out of uniform sat with his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, staring at a spot on the floor as if it might tell him what to do next. Wallace laughed the murmur off, the way he laughed off most things that didn't fit the story he was telling. He straightened his jacket, glanced at the jury to make sure they'd caught the joke, and reached for the water glass beside the witness stand with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed completely that the next 20 minutes belonged to him. He had no way of knowing that the woman watching him from the defense table had spent 6 months building a file with his name on it, drawer by drawer inside her own memory, because there had been nowhere safer to keep it. He had no way of knowing that every sentence he was about to speak, every detail he would exaggerate to make himself sound sharper, more certain, more heroic, was being measured against a timeline that existed nowhere on paper, a timeline only she carried and only she could unlock him. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and kept talking, entirely unaware that the woman in handcuffs was not the one on trial. 6 months earlier, the rain had come down thin and steady over Route 9, the kind that never announces itself as a storm, but soaks through a jacket just the same. Maya Reese drove with both hands on the wheel, 3 miles under the speed limit, the wipers ticking a slow rhythm against the windshield. She had clocked the unmarked cruiser at the gas station 2 miles back, parked nose out beside the air pump with its lights off, the way a car sits when it isn't waiting for gas. She hadn't needed to look twice. Some instincts don't come from training. Some come from years of learning. To read a road the way other people read a room. In her rear-view mirror, the cruiser pulled out behind her without urgency, matching her speed close enough to make its presence felt, and far enough to make it deniable. She kept her hands steady. She kept her breathing even 6 miles past that way. Her tail lights blinking rhythmically through the rain, his headlights holding steady in her mirror, neither of them saying anything, because neither of them needed to yet. Detective Frank Wallace had run this stretch of highway for years, and he had a feeling about cars like hers. Plain quiet, unremarkable, driven by someone who didn't fit the story he'd already decided to tell about who used this road and why. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't need to. He had a hunch, and 16 years on the force had taught him that hunches, spoken with enough confidence, tended to become truth by the time they reached the courtroom. He flicked on his lights. Maya eased onto the gravel shoulder without hesitation, cutting her engine, placing both hands on the wheel where they could be seen. She had done this before more times than she liked to count, and she had learned that the first 30 seconds of a traffic stop often decided everything that followed. What she watched next through her side mirror was something she would carry with her long after that night ended. Wallace stepping out of his cruiser, walking not toward her window first, but toward the back of his own vehicle. She watched him open his trunk. She watched him reach for something and tuck it against his side, before he ever said a word to her. By the time his flashlight hit her window, rain sliding down the beam in thin silver lines, she already understood, with the calm of someone doing quiet arithmetic in her head, exactly how the next several hours of her life were about to unfold. "License and registration," Wallace said, the light sweeping across her face, lingering longer than it needed to. "You always drive this careful, or is tonight special? Is there a reason for this stop, officer?" Her voice stayed level, not defiant, not afraid, just steady, the way water stays steady, even when the ground beneath it shifts. "The reason is I said so," he straightened, tapping the top of her car once with 2 fingers. A small proprietary sound. Step out of the vehicle. She had not consented to a search. She had not been read a reason. There was, in fact, no broken taillight, no swerving. None of the small violations that make a stop legal before it happens. Only a man's certainty that he already knew what kind of person she was, and a badge that made that certainty feel like enough. The cuffs went on wet metal, biting cold against her wrists, while rain slid down the back of her collar. Fant crossed the road, mounted above the gas station pumps she passed 2 miles earlier. A camera watched the entire exchange in silence, patient and indifferent the way only a machine can be. What Wallace did not know, could not have known standing there, soaked and satisfied, with the outline of a case forming in his head, was that the woman he was cuffing on the side of a dark highway had spent 14 months building a file with his name at the center of it, a file built not from paperwork, which could vanish, or from recordings which could be lost, but from the kind of memory that doesn't degrade, doesn't misplace itself, and doesn't require anyone's permission to exist. Every second of this stop, every choice he was making in the rain, was being recorded somewhere no warrant could ever reach, behind her own eyes, filed away, with the same discipline she had once been taught in a training room, 3 states from here, where instructors had written the same 2 words about her, again and again on evaluation after evaluation notices. Everything rattles never. He walked her to his cruiser with one hand on her shoulder, the other still holding whatever he'd carried from his own trunk, already composing in his mind the account he would give in his report, already deciding which details would make the story sound clean, which ones he would leave out entirely. He had no way of knowing that the story he was building that night, sentence by confident sentence, was not the one that would end up defining him. He had no way of knowing that somewhere behind him, in a parked car outside a gas station, he'd stopped noticing years ago. A young officer sat frozen with his hand on the radio, watching the whole thing unfold through his windshield, already beginning to understand that whatever he did with what he'd just seen would follow him for the rest of his career. The morning of the cross-examination arrived, heavy, with the kind of humidity that made the courthouse windows sweat from the inside, and by 8:00, the gallery was already full, retirees with paper cups of coffee, a court sketch artist sharpening pencils in the second row, a handful of reporters who had started treating this trial like the best show the county had produced in years. Nobody in that room, save for a handful of people who understood far more than they let on, expected the day to end the way it would. District Attorney Paul Hayes rose from the prosecution table with the easy confidence of a man who believed the hardest part of his job was already finished. He had Detective Wallace's testimony from the day before, 16 years of service behind it, a jury that had spent a full afternoon nodding along. All that remained in his mind was to let the defendant talk herself into a longer sentence. He buttoned his jacket, glanced at his notes out of habit rather than necessity, and turned toward the woman seated calmly at the defense table. "Mrs. Reese, he began. You expect this jury to believe you remember every detail of that night. 6 months ago in the rain. To the minute memory is my job, Counselor Maya said. Her voice hadn't changed since the day before, level, unhurried. The voice of someone who had said harder things in harder rooms and lived to describe them plainly. You told this court you have no job. I told this court I wasn't permitted to discuss it yet. A small pause, not for effect, but because some sentences deserve room to land. You didn't ask the right question. A ripple crossed the gallery, quiet enough that the judge didn't reach for his gavel, loud enough that Hayes felt it and adjusted his footing. Like a man walking on a floor that had just shifted slightly beneath him. He pressed on anyway because that was the job. Because 30 years in courtrooms teaches you that hesitation reads as weakness to a jury, even when hesitation might be the wisest thing in the room. Let's talk about the firearm Detective Wallace found in your apartment. Let's, Maya said. Ask him where he was standing when he says he found it. I'm asking you then, ask him first where he was standing at 9:23, the night he pulled me over. Ask him what he was doing at his own trunk before he ever approached my window. He'll tell you he doesn't recall. I recall to the second. Hayes glanced toward the jury, searching for the skepticism he'd been counting on, and found instead something closer to attention, the particular focused stillness of 12 people who have started listening for reasons that have nothing to do with the lawyer in front of them. In the third row, Detective Frank Wallace sat with his arms crossed, jaw tight, watching a woman he had cuffed on a dark highway 6 months earlier speak with a precision that no longer looked like performance. It looked, for the first time since this trial began, like preparation. You're asking this jury to take your word over. A 16-year veteran of this police force, he said, his voice rising now, reaching for the room the way Wallace had reached for it the day before. I'm asking this jury to take the truth over a version of events that changed twice. Between his arrest report and his testimony yesterday, Maya said, that's not my word, Counselor. That's the transcript. You can read it back whenever you're ready. Judge Marsh, who had spent 20 years learning to recognize the exact moment a case tipped from routine into something the county would talk about for years, set down his pen and studied the woman at the defense table. With new and careful attention, he wrote a single word on his notepad, underlined it twice, and said nothing at all. Because some silences carry more authority than any gavel, Hayes tried one more angle, the one he'd been saving, the one he believed would finally crack. The composure that had held for 2 straight days. If you're so certain, Miss Reese, so precise about every detail, then tell this jury plainly, who exactly do you work for? The courtroom went still, in the particular way rooms go still when everyone senses, without being told that they are about to hear something they will repeat for the rest of their lives. Maya folded her hands, the chain between her wrists, making one small, unhurried sound against the wooden rail in front of her, and looked directly at Detective Wallace for the first time all morning. His arms, crossed a moment before in practiced confidence, slowly came undone. I'm not permitted to answer that today, Counselor, she said, but by the time I can, you're going to want to be sitting down. Judge Marcia adjourned the session into a silence so complete that the ceiling fan seemed loud by comparison. Nobody in the gallery moved right away. They sat instead replaying her words, recalculating everything they thought they'd understood about who belonged in handcuffs and who belonged behind a badge, because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with sirens or gunfire. Sometimes it arrives quietly in a woman's folded hands, and a sentence delivered without raising her voice. And it rearranges a courtroom's entire understanding of itself before anyone fully realizes what has happened. What this story asks us to sit with isn't simple, and it shouldn't be. It's a reminder that a badge is not the same thing as the truth, and that composure under pressure is its own quiet form of strength, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. It's a reminder that black women in this country have too often been asked to prove their innocence before anyone bothers to question the accusation, and that patience, when paired with unshakable integrity, can outlast even the loudest lie told under oath. And it's a reminder that most police officers serve with honesty and courage every single day, which is exactly why the ones who don't, the ones who trade the public's trust for a shortcut, deserve to be held to the full weight of the oath they swore. If this story moved something in you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and tell me what you think happens when that courtroom door opens again. Do you think Detective Wallace already senses what's coming? Do you think justice, when it finally arrives, ever really feels like enough? I read every comment, and I want to know which line in this story hit you the hardest. And if you want to see exactly how far this goes, when the truth finally has a name, stay close because the next chapter is coming. And it changes everything. You think you understand who is really on trial,